The story of the Petlyakov Pe-8 begins in the tense atmosphere of the late 1930s when Soviet aviation found itself caught between rapid technological progress and the looming threat of war in Europe. By this time, major powers such as Germany, Britain, and the United States had begun to prioritize heavy bombers as strategic tools for long-range warfare. The Soviets, however, had invested much of their resources into tactical aviation and medium bombers. Aircraft like the SB and DB-3 were useful for battlefield support and medium-range strikes, but the Soviet Union lacked a true heavy bomber capable of penetrating deep into enemy territory. The leadership of the Red Air Force was divided on the issue. Some argued that the sheer vastness of Soviet territory demanded strategic aviation for deterrence and retaliatory strikes. Others, more aligned with Stalin's vision of a primarily offensive army, insisted that tanks and tactical aircraft would be decisive in any future conflict. The requirement for a 4-engine long-range bomber nevertheless grew in urgency by 1934-1935, as intelligence about foreign developments became clearer. The Tupolev Design Bureau had earlier attempted to meet this demand with the ANT-42, a prototype heavy bomber, but the project struggled with delays and technical compromises. In 1936, the Soviet government officially issued specifications for a new strategic bomber with the capability to carry up to 5 tons of bombs over ranges exceeding 3,000 kilometers. It was to be an aircraft capable of striking industrial centers far behind enemy lines, including the possibility of targets such as Berlin. Into this challenge stepped Vladimir Petlyakov, an engineer who had previously worked under the famed Andrei Tupolev. Petlyakov's design bureau took over development when Tupolev was arrested during the Stalinist purges, a political disaster that sent shockwaves through the Soviet aviation industry. Many of the brightest Soviet engineers were imprisoned, exiled, or forced into so-called charashkas, secret prison design bureaus where they continued to design aircraft under duress. Petlyakov himself was incarcerated, but like others was compelled to continue his work under NKVD supervision. Despite these obstacles, the design that emerged, first known as the TB-7 and later renamed the Pe-8 after Petlyakov's death, was a remarkable achievement for Soviet aviation. It incorporated several innovative features for its time, including a pressurized cabin for high-altitude flight in some prototypes, robust defensive armament, and the ability to carry a variety of payloads. Unlike medium bombers, which often relied on speed and maneuverability for survival, the Pe-8 was designed for endurance, altitude, and defensive firepower. It was to be the spearhead of a fledgling Soviet strategic bombing arm. The path from blueprint to working prototype, however, was anything but straightforward. The Pe-8's development was plagued by shortages of reliable engines. Early designs intended to use the Mikulin AM-34FRN, a liquid-cooled V12 engine, but production difficulties and shifting priorities forced engineers to experiment with alternative power plants. This led to a confusing variety of prototypes powered by different engines, from the Kuromsky AKSH-30 diesel to the Mikulin AM-35, and even the Shvetsov M-82 radial. Each substitution required redesigns, tests, and compromises, delaying the program. Yet, despite delays, by the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union had in its hands a prototype heavy bomber that, at least on paper, could rival the designs emerging in the West. The TB-7 completed its maiden flight in December 1936, marking a milestone in Soviet aviation. The aircraft's sheer size and power set it apart. It could carry a heavy bomb load over vast distances, and its defensive armament of multiple machine guns and cannons provided formidable protection compared to earlier Soviet bombers. Still, questions remained within the Soviet command. Could the USSR afford to mass-produce such a sophisticated and resource-intensive aircraft? Would it play a decisive role in the kind of war Stalin anticipated? And above all, could the fragile industrial base support not only production of the aircraft but also its advanced engines and spare parts? These questions would haunt the Pe-8's history, shaping its limited deployment and mixed legacy. By the outbreak of World War II, the Pe-8 existed as a small but significant symbol of Soviet ambition in the realm of strategic aviation. Its mere existence signaled that the USSR understood the value of deep strike capability. Yet it would take the fires of war and the desperate need to hit back against Nazi Germany for the Pe-8 to prove its worth. and to cement its reputation as the Soviet heavy bomber that reached Berlin when few believed it possible. The testing era of the TB-7, which would later be known as the Petlyakov Pe-8, revealed both the promise and the immense challenges of the Soviet Union's attempt to create a true heavy bomber. Following its maiden flight in December 1936, the prototype underwent a series of rigorous trials aimed at determining whether the ambitious specifications set out by Soviet authorities could actually be achieved in practice. At first glance, the aircraft seemed impressive. It was capable of lifting significant bomb loads, had space for a large crew, and carried defensive armament across multiple positions. Yet from the very beginning, the Pe-8's operational fate was tied to the troubled story of Soviet engine development in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The original design called for Michelin AM-34FRN engines, a liquid-cooled V-12 that was intended to give the bomber both power and reliability at high altitudes. However, production difficulties and competing demands from other aircraft programs made consistent delivery of these engines impossible. As a result, the Design Bureau began experimenting with alternative power plants. Some test aircraft were fitted with Michelin AM-35 engines, others with Karomsky H-30 diesel engines, and eventually the Shvetsov M82 radial was also tested. This created a situation where different Pe-8s in testing and early production runs could have radically different performance profiles. The frequent engine substitutions disrupted standardization, delayed production, and made logistics for future operations far more complex than anticipated. Performance during flight tests was mixed. On the positive side, the TB-7 showed impressive range for a Soviet aircraft, and it demonstrated the ability to operate at altitudes beyond the reach of many contemporary fighters. The bomber also had a sophisticated defensive suite for the era, with heavy machine guns and cannons placed to protect against attacks from multiple directions. Test crews noted that despite its size, the aircraft was generally stable in the air and could be flown with relative confidence. Yet the shortcomings were equally clear. Engine reliability was poor, and breakdowns occurred frequently during trial flights. Maintenance demands were high, requiring more ground crew attention than most Soviet aircraft of the time. The complexity of the airframe also made it slower to produce than medium bombers, and this ran counter to the Soviet military doctrine that emphasized mass production and quantity over technological refinement. Some military officials began to question whether the resources consumed by the Pe-8 program could have been better directed towards simpler aircraft such as the L-2 or Pe-2. Another experimental feature of the prototype was the inclusion of a pressurized cabin for high-altitude operations. This was an advanced concept at the time, rivaling similar developments in Western bomber projects. However, the technology was difficult to implement consistently in production models, and in practice, many aircraft did not retain full pressurization systems. Even so, the attempt reflected the Soviet ambition to create a strategic bomber that could match, if not surpass, Western standards. The transition from prototype to production was slow and uneven. In 1937, the first series of TB-7s were ordered, but political upheaval within the Soviet Union disrupted the program. The purges that had swept through the aviation sector claimed the careers and lives of many engineers and managers, including Andrei Tupolev, who had initially overseen the heavy bomber program. Petlyakov himself continued the project under forced conditions, and although the team pushed ahead, production was constantly interrupted by shifts in leadership, reallocation of resources, and changing military priorities. By the time the TB-7 was redesignated as the Pe-8 in honor of Petlyakov, who died in 1942, only a handful of aircraft had been built. The limited production numbers reflected both the technical difficulties and the uncertainty about how the aircraft would fit into Soviet military strategy. Still, each aircraft that rolled out of the factory represented a rare achievement, a Soviet four-engine bomber capable of strategic operations. In the years leading up to Operation Barbarossa, Pe-8s were gradually assigned to long-range aviation units for further evaluation. The aircraft were tested in long-distance flights, sometimes carrying heavy bomb loads, other times simulating deep penetration raids. These tests revealed that while the bomber could theoretically strike distant targets, sustaining such missions on a large scale would be nearly impossible given the small number of aircraft and the fragile support infrastructure. The Red Air Force thus entered the Second World War with a heavy bomber that was technologically impressive but operationally limited. Despite all these obstacles, the Pe-8 remained the only heavy bomber available to the Soviet Union. Its very existence provided options that otherwise would not have been possible. And in the desperate years of the early 1940s, even a small force of such aircraft would prove to have an outsized symbolic and psychological importance. When the German invasion began in June 1941, the Soviet Union was thrust into a desperate struggle for survival, and every available aircraft was pressed into service. For the Pe-8, this marked the true beginning of its operational career. At the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa, fewer than 30 aircraft were available, and many of those were still experimental or suffering from technical issues. Yet, as the Red Air Force reeled under catastrophic losses of fighters and medium bombers, the Pe-8 stood out as one of the few types capable of striking deep behind German lines. The first missions assigned to the Pe-8 units were experimental long-range raids intended to disrupt German supply lines and command centers. These early operations exposed the strengths and weaknesses of the design. On one hand, the Pe-8 could carry up to 5 tons of bombs over distances of 3,000 kilometers, allowing crews to target sites well beyond the front lines. On the other hand, the limited number of aircraft and their high maintenance demands meant that each sortie required significant planning and logistical support. Even a small mechanical failure could ground the aircraft for weeks, and with spare parts in short supply, maintaining operational readiness was a constant challenge. One of the most famous missions of the Pe-8 came in August 1941, when a small formation was dispatched to bomb Berlin itself. This operation had enormous symbolic significance. At that point in the war, German forces were advancing rapidly toward Moscow, and Soviet morale was faltering. By reaching Berlin, even with limited physical damage, the Soviets aimed to prove that the Reich's capital was not beyond reach. On the night of August 10-11, a group of Pe-8s took off from Pushkino near Moscow, navigating through German defenses and braving flak and fighter patrols. Despite heavy opposition, several aircraft succeeded in dropping bombs on Berlin. Although the damage inflicted was minor compared to the later Allied bombing campaigns, the psychological effect was considerable. It demonstrated to the world and to the Soviet people that the USSR could strike at the enemy's heart. These Berlin raids, however, also highlighted the vulnerabilities of the aircraft. Several Pe-8s were lost to German night fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and others were forced to turn back due to engine failures. Each loss was significant given the tiny fleet available. Crews were under immense pressure, flying long missions often without adequate escort protection. The complexity of navigation and the poor reliability of Soviet radios further complicated operations, especially in bad weather or over enemy territory. Nevertheless, the Red Air Force continued to employ the Pe-8 in deep raids against German-held cities, railway junctions, and industrial facilities. While never large in scale, usually involving just a handful of bombers at a time, these missions served both strategic and symbolic purposes. The bomber force was placed under the control of the Long-Range Aviation, ADD, which was tasked with striking vital targets in the enemy's rear. Soviet commanders recognized that while the Pe-8 could not match the scale of the RAF Bomber Command or the USAF, its operations forced the Germans to divert resources toward air defense and demonstrated that Soviet aviation could operate beyond the immediate battlefield. By late 1941 and into 1942, the aircraft also began to be used in more practical roles. Pe-8s were tasked with delivering heavy strikes against bridges, fuel depots, and concentration points for German troops and armor. The aircraft's ability to carry large bomb loads gave it unique value compared to medium bombers like the Pe-2 or Il-4. However, missions remained few, and results varied depending on weather conditions, mechanical reliability, and enemy resistance. At the same time, Pe-8s were used for transport and special missions. Their large capacity made them suitable for carrying supplies or personnel on critical assignments. One of the most remarkable of these occurred in 1942, when a Pe-8 carried a Soviet diplomatic mission led by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov to the United States via Britain. This extraordinary flight required crossing hostile airspace and the North Atlantic, a feat that highlighted the aircraft's range and versatility. The success of the mission was a propaganda triumph and underscored the Pe-8's role as more than just a bomber. It was a tool of Soviet diplomacy as well. Despite these achievements, operational numbers remained limited. Throughout 1942, production continued at a slow pace, with frequent design changes to accommodate different engines or modifications. By the time of the German advance toward Stalingrad, the entire operational force numbered barely over 30 aircraft. This meant that while the Pe-8 could not change the course of battles by itself, it remained a rare strategic asset in a Red Air Force otherwise dominated by tactical aviation. In these early years of service, the Pe-8 had proven its capability to strike Berlin, to operate at long range, and to adapt to unconventional roles. But it also revealed the structural weakness of Soviet heavy bomber doctrine. There were simply too few aircraft, too many technical problems, and too little industrial support to make the Pe-8 a true strategic weapon on the scale of its Western counterparts. Still, within its limitations, the Pe-8 carved out a place as a symbol of resilience, determination, and the Soviet will to fight back against overwhelming odds. As the war progressed into 1942 and 1943, the Pe-8 entered a phase of adaptation in which its role evolved from daring but limited deep penetration raids to more pragmatic uses dictated by the harsh realities of Soviet industry and the battlefield. The early Berlin missions had shown the aircraft's potential, but they also revealed its fragility. Production bottlenecks and the chronic shortage of suitable engines meant that the number of operational aircraft remained painfully small. Even at the height of the war, the Soviet Union never fielded more than a few dozen Pe-8s at a time, and this forced commanders to employ the bomber selectively. The long-range aviation, ADD, began to use the Pe-8 for missions where its heavy bomb load and extended range could make a difference. Railway hubs, ammunition depots, and fuel storage sites behind German lines became priority targets. The bomber's ability to carry bombs weighing up to 5,000 kilograms, including the massive FAB-5000, made it especially valuable for striking fortified positions or industrial plants that smaller aircraft could not damage effectively. A number of high-profile strikes were carried out in this period, such as raids against German-held Smolensk, Königsberg, and other strategic targets in occupied territory. Although the scale was limited compared to the massed Allied bomber raids in the West, these missions inflicted real disruption on German logistics and served as visible proof of Soviet long-range striking capability. Combat losses, however, remained a persistent problem. German air defenses grew stronger as the war dragged on, and even small groups of Pe-8s flying at night faced intense anti-aircraft fire and the ever-present danger of night fighters. The large silhouette and slower speed of the aircraft made it a vulnerable target, and crews often endured harrowing journeys through flak barrages. When combined with mechanical failures, it was not uncommon for fewer than half of the bombers dispatched on a mission to return in serviceable condition. Each attrition loss was a severe blow, not only because of the limited production, but also due to the highly trained crews who could not be easily replaced. To cope with these challenges, tactical adaptations were introduced. Crews refined navigation methods, often relying on visual landmarks or newly developed Soviet radio aids, though these were crude compared to Western systems. Missions increasingly took place at night to reduce losses from fighters, though this came at the cost of bombing accuracy. Some Pe-8s were even modified for specialized roles. For example, a small number were adapted to carry the enormous FAB-5000 bomb, which weighed more than 5 tons. Dropping such a weapon required precise handling and immense skill, but its destructive power was unmatched by any other Soviet aircraft. One famous strike in 1943 involved the use of a Pe-8 to deliver an FAB-5000 against German positions at Orel during the Battle of Kursk. The resulting explosion caused devastation across a wide area and demonstrated the bomber's unique capability for psychological as well as physical impact. Beyond bombing, the Pe-8 was also used in unusual ways. Some aircraft were configured as transports, flying critical supplies, equipment, and personnel to embattled fronts or partisan groups operating behind German lines. Their long range and capacity made them ideal for such missions, especially during the most desperate periods of the war when overland routes were cut off. On other occasions, the aircraft was used for diplomatic and high-level political transport. The most notable of these was the Molotov mission in 1942, but similar flights followed, cementing the Pe-8's reputation as a flexible strategic asset rather than a bomber alone. In comparison with Western heavy bombers such as the B-17 Flying Fortress or the Avro Lancaster, the Pe-8 remained a rarity, both in terms of production numbers and operational use. While the Americans and British deployed thousands of heavy bombers in sustained campaigns, the Soviets had only dozens. The difference stemmed from industrial capacity, doctrine, and priorities. Soviet strategy emphasized tactical aviation and ground support, with the Il-2 Sturmovik becoming the workhorse of the Red Air Force. Strategic bombing, though recognized as valuable, was never resourced at a level sufficient to make it a decisive element of Soviet operations. The Pe-8 thus occupied a paradoxical position, technologically impressive and capable of extraordinary feats, but never numerous enough to exert the kind of strategic pressure achieved by Western bomber fleets. Nevertheless, each successful mission carried significant weight. The Germans were forced to take the threat seriously, diverting resources to air defense and night fighter units even though the Soviet heavy bomber presence was small. Within the USSR, the Pe-8 became a symbol of long-range aviation, embodying the idea that Soviet aircraft could match those of foreign powers. Its crews gained a reputation for bravery and skill, often flying missions deep into enemy territory with little margin for error. By 1943, the Pe-8 had established itself as a specialized but respected element of the Soviet arsenal. It could not deliver mass destruction, but it could achieve strategic effects out of proportion to its numbers. Whether by striking Berlin, demolishing fortified positions with super-heavy bombs, or carrying out crucial diplomatic flights, the Pe-8 demonstrated adaptability and resilience. Its combat record was uneven, marked by losses and technical difficulties, but within its limitations, it proved that Soviet aviation could project power far beyond the battlefield. By 1943 and 1944, the Pe-8 had undergone several rounds of modification as engineers and crews sought to improve its reliability and adapt it to the shifting demands of the war. The most persistent problem remained the engines. Early aircraft had been fitted with a bewildering variety of power plants: Mikulin AM-35A liquid-cooled engines, Choromsky AKH-30 diesels, and eventually Shvetsov M82 radials. Each variant had its advantages and flaws. The diesel engines, for example, offered good fuel economy and thus greater range, but they were prone to fires and mechanical breakdowns that endangered entire missions. The AM-35A liquid-cooled engines provided strong performance but were in short supply, as production was prioritized for the high-altitude MiG-3 fighter. The M82 radials proved to be the most practical long-term solution, offering greater availability and improved reliability, and by 1943 most production aircraft were standardized with them. Alongside engine changes, defensive armament was also improved. Early Pe-8s had a mixture of 7.62 mm and 12.7 machine guns, as well as a 20mm cannon in some positions. Operational experience quickly revealed that heavier armament was essential against German fighters. Subsequent modifications increased the number of large-caliber weapons and improved gun turrets, though limitations of space and weight prevented a radical transformation. Despite these efforts, the Pe-8 remained more vulnerable than Allied bombers such as the B-17 or Lancaster, both of which benefited from decades of refinement and massive industrial support. Bombing capabilities, however, were enhanced. The aircraft could carry not only standard bombs, but also the FAB-5000, a super-heavy bomb that became one of the Pe-8's trademarks. Dropping this weapon required a specially modified bomb bay and expert handling, but its destructive power was immense. The explosion of a single FAB-5000 could obliterate hardened positions, bunkers, and command centers. Soviet propaganda seized on these missions, portraying the Pe-8 as a fearsome strategic weapon capable of devastating enemy strongholds. At the Battle of Kursk and in other operations, such bombs were used with dramatic effect, not only damaging German fortifications, but also shaking the morale of enemy troops. Variants of the aircraft also emerged to expand its utility. Some Pe-8s were converted into transport versions capable of carrying large cargo loads or ferrying personnel across long distances. These proved particularly useful in 1943-1944 when the Soviet Union sought to strengthen ties with the Western Allies. Pe-8s flew diplomatic missions to Tehran and London, carrying Soviet delegations to high-level conferences. The aircraft thus played a dual role, both as a weapon of war and as a diplomatic bridge. The fact that it could safely cross thousands of kilometers of airspace, much of it hostile, testified to the skill of its crews and the resilience of the design. Other experimental versions included Pe-8s fitted for reconnaissance and long-range patrol duties. Their ability to fly at high altitude and over great distances made them suitable for mapping enemy territory and observing troop concentrations. A few aircraft were also modified as testbeds for engines and weapons, underscoring how valuable the platform was to Soviet aviation research even outside its bombing role. In the closing stages of the war, experimental uses even considered adapting the Pe-8 for guiding unmanned aircraft or carrying unconventional payloads, though such projects never moved beyond limited trials. Production of the Pe-8 never reached the levels originally envisioned. Between 1936 and 1944, only about 93 aircraft were built, a fraction compared to the thousands of heavy bombers constructed by the United States and Britain. Soviet industry, already stretched by the demands of war, simply could not prioritize such a complex and resource-intensive machine. Instead, efforts focused on producing vast numbers of Il-2s, Yak fighters, and medium bombers, which were judged to have a greater immediate impact on the battlefield. The Pe-8 thus remained a rare and elite tool, reserved for missions of high strategic or political significance. Yet within its small numbers, the Pe-8 represented a kind of technological laboratory for Soviet aviation. Each variant incorporated lessons learned from combat, testing new engines, new armament, or new mission profiles. In this sense, it served as both a combat aircraft and a development platform, pushing Soviet designers toward the limits of what their wartime industry could achieve. Its evolution also influenced thinking about post-war strategic aviation, providing valuable experience in handling long-range, four-engine bombers. By late 1944, as the Red Army advanced westward and the front lines moved ever closer to Germany, the strategic role of the Pe-8 diminished somewhat. With Soviet artillery and tactical aviation now able to reach German positions directly, the need for deep penetration bombing lessened. Still, the bomber continued to fly missions against major cities, transport hubs, and entrenched positions, while also serving in its diplomatic and transport capacities. It was a versatile, if limited, weapon, embodying both the achievements and the constraints of Soviet wartime aviation. By the final years of the war, the Pe-8 had already secured its place as a unique but limited element of the Red Air Force, and its operational role continued to evolve as the Soviet Union advanced into Eastern Europe and eventually toward Berlin itself. Unlike in 1941-1942, when its flights had been daring ventures into hostile skies far beyond Soviet front lines, by 1944 and 1945, the bomber was operating with greater freedom. German air defenses, though still formidable, were increasingly overstretched, and the Luftwaffe was no longer the dominant force it had once been. This shift allowed the Pe-8 to participate in operations with somewhat reduced risk, though its numbers remained too small for massed raids of the kind seen in Western Europe. The most significant contribution of the Pe-8 during this late stage was its ability to deliver extremely heavy bombs against fortified German positions and logistical hubs. In the campaigns across Belarus, Poland, and into Germany, Pe-8s were dispatched to strike at railway marshalling yards, supply depots, and defensive strongpoints that blocked Soviet offensives. Their ability to carry the enormous FAB-5000 bomb gave Soviet commanders a unique weapon for breaking heavily reinforced positions. These missions were carefully planned and highly visible, often highlighted in Soviet media as examples of technological power and vengeance against the enemy. At the same time, the aircraft's symbolic value continued to be cultivated. The memory of the Berlin raids of 1941 was invoked repeatedly, and the Pe-8 was presented as the Soviet answer to the massive strategic fleets of the Allies. While the Red Army's victories were driven largely by ground offensives and tactical aviation, the very existence of a heavy bomber capable of intercontinental flights was used to demonstrate that Soviet technology was on par with that of the Western powers. The diplomatic missions of the Pe-8 reinforced this message. Beyond the famous Molotov flight to Washington in 1942, additional journeys carried delegations to Allied conferences in Tehran and elsewhere, with the aircraft effectively serving as a flying emblem of Soviet reach and resilience. Combat effectiveness, however, remained constrained. Even in 1945, the total number of Pe-8s in service did not exceed a few dozen. Losses to mechanical failure continued, and spare part shortages made sustained operations difficult. Crews often had to cannibalize one aircraft to keep another flying. By contrast, the United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force were sending thousands of B-17s, B-24s, and Lancasters on missions that dwarfed anything the Pe-8 force could achieve. In practical terms, Soviet long-range bombing never reached the strategic scale seen in Western Europe, and Soviet military doctrine continued to emphasize ground support and tactical strikes as the decisive factors in victory. Nevertheless, the Pe-8's legacy was cemented by its endurance and adaptability. It had served as a heavy bomber, a transport, a diplomatic courier, and a test platform for engines and weapons. Its operational history was not one of mass raids, but of carefully chosen, high-profile missions that carried disproportionate political and psychological weight. In the context of Soviet aviation, it represented an achievement against the odds given the industrial limitations and political upheavals of the late 1930s and early 1940s. After the war, the Pe-8 quickly faded from frontline service. Production had ceased in 1944, and no large-scale effort was made to revive it once peace was secured. The Soviet Union, having observed the effectiveness of American and British strategic bombing campaigns, began to reassess its own doctrine and to lay the groundwork for a future strategic bomber force. The experience gained with the Pe-8, its long-range navigation, high-altitude flight, heavy payload management, and defensive armament, fed directly into the development of post-war Soviet bombers such as the Tu-4, which was itself based on the American B-29. Only a handful of Pe-8s survived into the late 1940s, mostly in secondary roles as testbeds or transports. Eventually, they were retired altogether, with a few preserved in museums as reminders of their unusual history. Today, the Pe-8 is remembered less for the scale of its operations and more for the symbolic feats it accomplished. The bold raids on Berlin, the carrying of Soviet diplomats across continents, and the demonstration that despite enormous industrial and political obstacles, the Soviet Union could indeed field a strategic bomber. In retrospect, the Pe-8 was never a decisive weapon of war, but it stood as a technological and psychological milestone. It proved that Soviet aviation could produce an aircraft in the same category as the most advanced bombers of the era, even if only in limited numbers. Its story illustrates both the ambition and the constraints of wartime Soviet industry, as well as the determination of the crews who flew it under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Though overshadowed by the massive fleets of Western heavy bombers, the Pe-8 remains a distinct symbol of Soviet ingenuity, resilience, and the determination to strike at the enemy no matter the cost. The legacy of the Petlyakov Pe-8 can only be fully understood by placing it within the wider context of Soviet aviation and global military history. In pure numerical and operational terms, it never approached the significance of Western heavy bombers such as the B-17, B-24, or Lancaster, which flew thousands of sorties and devastated enemy infrastructure on a scale the Soviet Air Force could not replicate. Yet the Pe-8's contribution was not measured in tonnage of bombs dropped, but rather in what it represented for Soviet technological ambition, strategic doctrine, and political symbolism. The aircraft was, in essence, the Soviet Union's sole foray into heavy bomber development during the Second World War. With only around 90 units produced in total, its role was necessarily limited, but each Pe-8 was a precious asset. Its crews were regarded as elite within the long-range aviation branch, tasked with missions of the highest importance. The daring raids on Berlin in 1941, though militarily minor, had an enormous psychological effect. They served as proof to the Soviet public that the enemy's capital was vulnerable, at a time when German armies were approaching Moscow. Internationally, they signaled to both enemies and allies that the USSR possessed a long-range strike capability, however modest in scale. Beyond bombing, the Pe-8's diplomatic flights stand out as among its most enduring contributions. The 1942 Molotov mission to Washington was one of the most extraordinary episodes of the war, highlighting the aircraft's range and resilience. The successful crossing of hostile skies and the Atlantic Ocean carried immense symbolic weight, showing that Soviet aviation could support statecraft on a global scale. Later flights to Tehran and London reinforced this role, establishing the Pe-8 not only as a weapon but also as a tool of diplomacy. In this sense, it bridged the gap between military operations and political objectives in a way few other Soviet aircraft of the period could claim. Technologically, the Pe-8 provided invaluable experience for Soviet designers. It exposed the immense challenges of building and maintaining large four-engine aircraft in wartime conditions, from the constant struggle with unreliable engines to the logistical difficulties of supplying spare parts. These lessons directly informed post-war development. When Soviet engineers were tasked with producing the Tu-4, a reverse-engineered copy of the American B-29, they drew on the operational knowledge gained with the Pe-8 to understand long-range navigation, crew coordination, high-altitude flight, and defensive armament requirements. In this way, the Pe-8 served as a stepping stone, preparing Soviet industry and the Air Force for the atomic age of strategic bombers. Culturally, the Pe-8 has occupied a curious place in Soviet memory. Unlike the Il-2 Sturmovik, celebrated as the flying tank of the Red Army, or the Yak and La series of fighters, it was never mass-produced or widely seen by the troops and citizens. Its presence was felt more through news reports of spectacular missions than through daily familiarity. For this reason, it became something of a legend, remembered for specific exploits rather than for continuous service. The Berlin raids, the use of the FAB-5000 bomb, and the diplomatic journeys gave it a reputation disproportionate to its numbers. After the war, the surviving Pe-8s faded quickly from frontline service, overshadowed by the arrival of jet technology and the new doctrine of nuclear deterrence. A few were retained for testing purposes, serving as platforms for new engines and experimental equipment. Others were eventually scrapped as obsolete. Only fragments and a handful of preserved examples remained, scattered in museums, serving as silent reminders of a unique chapter in Soviet aviation history. In retrospect, the Pe-8 embodies both the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet war effort. It demonstrated ingenuity, determination, and the ability to produce a heavy bomber under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Yet it also revealed the limits of Soviet industrial capacity and the doctrinal focus on tactical aviation over strategic bombing. It could not shape the outcome of the war as the Allied heavy bombers did, but it left an indelible mark as the Soviet Union's first and only wartime heavy bomber, a machine that proved that even in the darkest days of 1941, the USSR could strike the enemy's heart. Today, historians regard the Pe-8 as a symbol of ambition constrained by reality, a bridge between early Soviet aviation and the powerful strategic forces of the Cold War. Its story is one of perseverance, improvisation, and adaptation, qualities that defined much of the Soviet war effort. Though few in number, the Pe-8s carved out a place in history, remembered less for mass impact and more for their extraordinary feats. The bomber that carried diplomats across oceans, dropped bombs on Berlin, and stood as a testament to what Soviet aviation could achieve under the most trying circumstances. In examining the lesser-known chapters of the Pe-8 story, one finds a number of unusual missions, experimental uses, and forgotten contributions that broaden the understanding of its significance. While its combat raids and diplomatic flights form the most publicized aspects of its service, the bomber also played roles in research, weapons testing, and secret operations that rarely reached the headlines. These missions highlight the adaptability of the aircraft and the willingness of Soviet commanders to exploit every possible use from their scarce heavy bombers. One of the most intriguing aspects was the use of the Pe-8 as a test platform. With its large airframe, the bomber could accommodate experimental engines, fuel systems, and equipment in ways that smaller aircraft could not. Several Pe-8s were fitted with different types of engines during their service life, sometimes not for standardization, but specifically to evaluate performance for future designs. Radials, liquid-cooled engines, and diesels all found their way onto Pe-8 variants, and the data collected from these flights provided insights that would later be valuable in the development of post-war bombers. The aircraft also served as a testbed for heavy ordnance, including oversized bombs that pushed the limits of what its bomb bays could handle. The FAB-5000 is the best known, but there were trials with other large weapons as well, some of which never entered mass production. Beyond testing, the Pe-8 was occasionally used for missions that fell outside the traditional bombing role. A few aircraft were adapted for long-range reconnaissance flights, carrying cameras and other surveillance equipment to photograph enemy positions deep in occupied territory. These missions were dangerous and often carried out at night or high altitude to avoid detection. They provided valuable intelligence to Soviet commanders planning offensives, complementing ground reconnaissance and partisan reports. Transport operations also remained an important secondary function. With its long range and substantial payload capacity, the Pe-8 could deliver critical supplies to remote fronts or to partisan units operating behind enemy lines. It could also evacuate personnel or ferry important equipment across the vast distances of the Soviet Union. During certain operations, it was used to move specialized teams, including engineers, intelligence officers, or even cultural delegations tasked with maintaining morale. Its ability to operate over long distances gave it a versatility unmatched by smaller Soviet bombers. There were also episodes where the Pe-8 was considered for roles that pushed the boundaries of contemporary aviation thinking. In the early 1940s, Soviet engineers experimented with the idea of using heavy bombers as motherships for smaller aircraft, towing or carrying them part of the way to distant targets. While this concept was never developed into a fully operational system for the Pe-8, discussions and limited experiments demonstrated the breadth of roles envisioned for it. Similarly, there were proposals to adapt the bomber for use in guiding unmanned explosive-laden aircraft, a primitive form of drone warfare. These projects did not progress beyond trial stages, but they reveal the extent to which the Pe-8 was seen as a potential multi-role platform. Another lesser-known aspect of its service was the symbolic and propaganda role it played within the Soviet Union. While most citizens never saw a Pe-8 in person, reports of its missions were widely circulated. Newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated its strikes on Berlin, its ability to carry the largest bombs, and its role in diplomatic journeys. This gave the Pe-8 an outsized presence in the Soviet wartime imagination, where it came to symbolize technological parity with the Western Allies. Even when the aircraft was grounded due to mechanical problems or shortages, its reputation as a powerful and strategic weapon was maintained for morale purposes. Finally, the Pe-8 also left behind stories from the crews themselves, pilots, navigators, and gunners who often flew missions at the limits of endurance. Their accounts describe flights through storms without modern navigational aids, running battles with German night fighters, and the constant struggle to keep unreliable engines running. These personal stories, though less publicized, underscore the human dimension of operating such a rare and demanding machine. Many crews came to view their aircraft almost as individuals, each with unique quirks and temperaments shaped by its particular engines, modifications, and history. In these lesser-seen roles, test platform, reconnaissance aircraft, transport, propaganda symbol, and experimental tool, the Pe-8 extended its influence far beyond the limited number of bombers ever built. It never became the backbone of Soviet long-range aviation, but it filled critical niches and provided experience that proved invaluable for the future. Its story is thus not only one of combat and diplomacy, but also of hidden contributions that bridged wartime improvisation with post-war ambition, ensuring its place as one of the most remarkable and multifaceted aircraft of the Soviet Second World War effort. In the aftermath of victory in 1945, the Pe-8 quickly transitioned from a wartime necessity into a technological relic. Its operational career had spanned the most difficult years of the Soviet-German conflict. But once the immediate threat receded, its limitations became increasingly apparent. The aircraft that once symbolized Soviet strategic reach was soon overshadowed by the arrival of jet propulsion, captured German technology, and most decisively, the Soviet decision to build its post-war bomber force around designs influenced by the American B-29 Superfortress. The Pe-8 remained in limited service in the immediate post-war period, but its numbers dwindled rapidly. Only a handful of airframes survived the brutal attrition of wartime use, and these were often in poor condition, cannibalized for spare parts, or heavily worn out from long-range missions. The Soviet Air Force did not consider restarting production. Pe-8 assembly had already ceased in 1944, as priorities shifted toward fighters, attack aircraft, and preparation for new bomber designs. Instead, the surviving aircraft were reassigned to secondary roles. Some were used as transports, hauling cargo and personnel during the transitional years of demobilization. Others became testbeds fitted with experimental engines, radar systems, or avionics to provide data for the next generation of Soviet bombers. Despite its declining operational relevance, the Pe-8 retained symbolic value within the Soviet Union. Historians and propagandists emphasized its role in the Berlin raids of 1941, its unique ability to carry the massive FAB 5000 bomb, and its diplomatic flights to Allied capitals. These achievements were highlighted as proof that the USSR had developed its own heavy bomber independently, without reliance on Western technology. In a political climate increasingly shaped by the early Cold War, this narrative was important. It demonstrated continuity, that the Soviet Union had not only survived the war but had done so with aviation achievements that could be presented alongside those of Britain and the United States. The practical lessons of the Pe-8 directly influenced post-war Soviet bomber development. Engineers who had worked on the Pe-8 program carried forward their experience in building large airframes, integrating defensive gun positions, and managing long-range operations. These insights were crucial as the Soviet Union embarked on the Tu-4 project, a reverse-engineered copy of the American B-29 obtained through the inspection of aircraft that had landed in Soviet territory after bombing raids on Japan. Although the Tu-4 owed much to its American model, the Soviet ability to reproduce and operate such an aircraft was rooted partly in the technical knowledge acquired from the Pe-8 program. In this way, the Pe-8 served as a bridge between early Soviet aviation and the jet-powered strategic forces of the Cold War. Culturally, however, the Pe-8 remained an obscure figure. Unlike the Il-2, immortalized as the flying tank, or the Yak fighters celebrated in countless Soviet wartime accounts, the Pe-8 was never widely seen by the public. Its scarcity meant that only a select group of airmen and engineers interacted with it directly. For ordinary Soviet citizens, its image was tied almost entirely to the press reports of its missions, which elevated it into a semi-legendary status. For those within the aviation community, it was remembered as a challenging but pioneering aircraft, a machine that demanded constant improvisation but also inspired deep respect. By the 1950s, the remaining Pe-8s had been retired from service. A few survived in museums, notably in Monino, where aviation enthusiasts and historians could study the rare example of a Soviet heavy bomber from the Second World War. The aircraft's rugged lines, defensive turrets, and massive bomb bay evoked a bygone era when long-range bombing in the Soviet Union was experimental and fragile, yet bold and ambitious. In retrospect, the Pe-8's legacy lies less in its combat record than in its symbolism and the path it opened for Soviet aviation. It proved that the USSR could design and operate a strategic bomber under immense political and industrial strain. It highlighted the gap between Soviet doctrine, which prioritized ground support, and the Western model of strategic air campaigns, but it also kept alive the idea of long-range aviation within the Red Air Force. When the Cold War demanded a credible Soviet bomber fleet, the foundations laid by the Pe-8's troubled but courageous service were remembered and built upon. Thus, while it never shaped the war in the way Allied heavy bombers did, the Petlyakov Pe-8 stands as a monument to Soviet perseverance. It was the aircraft that bombed Berlin when the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, that carried Soviet leaders to negotiations across oceans, and that taught Soviet engineers how to master the complexities of strategic bombing. In the history of aviation, it occupies a unique niche, as both a symbol of ambition under constraint and a precursor to the strategic bomber force that would define the Soviet Union's power in the decades to come. The story of the Petlyakov Pe-8 concludes with a legacy defined not by scale of destruction, but by its symbolic weight and the lessons it provided for the Soviet Union. Unlike the massive fleets of American and British bombers that hammered German cities in waves of hundreds of aircraft, the Pe-8 remained a rare sight in the skies, deployed in small numbers and often reserved for missions of special importance. Yet its existence alone placed the USSR within the same circle of powers that had mastered the art of heavy bomber construction, an achievement remarkable given the political repression, industrial shortages, and doctrinal disputes that had shaped its development. Strategically, the Pe-8 never transformed the Eastern Front. Soviet victory was achieved primarily through ground offensives supported by tactical aviation and artillery. Nevertheless, the Pe-8 provided Soviet commanders with a long-range option they otherwise lacked. Its raids on Berlin in 1941 proved that even at the darkest moment of the war, when German armies were deep inside Soviet territory, the USSR could still strike at the enemy's capital. Its ability to deliver the colossal FAB-5000 bomb gave it a destructive power unique among Soviet aircraft, used to shatter fortified positions and inflict heavy blows against German infrastructure. These missions may have been few in number, but their symbolic resonance far exceeded their practical effects. Technologically, the Pe-8 represented a bold step forward. Its pressurized cabin prototypes, multiple engine variants, and ability to adapt to different roles showed the willingness of Soviet designers to innovate under difficult circumstances. The aircraft's constant struggles with engines reflected the broader limitations of Soviet wartime industry, but they also spurred experiments that yielded valuable engineering knowledge. The lessons learned in operating a 4-engine heavy bomber, crew coordination, long-range navigation, fuel management, and defensive armament systems were foundational for the Soviet bomber force that emerged after 1945. Without the Pe-8, the transition to aircraft like the Tu-4 and eventually the Tu-95 would have been far more difficult. Politically and diplomatically, the Pe-8 also made a mark that extended beyond its combat record. By carrying Vyacheslav Molotov and his delegation to Washington in 1942, the aircraft helped facilitate one of the most significant diplomatic exchanges of the war, strengthening the alliance between the USSR, Britain, and the United States. In this way, the Pe-8 was not only a weapon of war, but also an instrument of statecraft, its long wings carrying messages of survival and cooperation across continents. Few other aircraft of the Second World War could claim to have been both a strategic bomber and a diplomatic courier of such importance. Culturally, the Pe-8 occupies a niche status. It was never celebrated on the same scale as the Il-2 Sturmovik or Yakovlev fighters, which became icons of Soviet air power. Instead, the Pe-8 lived on as a legend tied to specific feats: the Berlin raids, the FAB 5000 strikes, and the Molotov mission. Its rarity gave it an aura of exclusivity, remembered not for everyday presence but for extraordinary moments. In Soviet aviation history, it became a symbol of endurance and ambition, a reminder that even under the direst of conditions, the Soviet Union could design and operate an aircraft of world-class potential. By the late 1940s, the Pe-8 had disappeared from active service, its remaining airframes relegated to secondary duties or scrapped. A few were preserved in museums where they stand today as relics of an era when strategic bombing was only beginning to take shape in Soviet doctrine. For aviation historians, the Pe-8 remains a fascinating case study of ambition constrained by resources, an aircraft that could perform feats far beyond what its small production run might suggest. In conclusion, the Petlyakov Pe-8 was never a war winner, nor did it reshape the course of the conflict through massed raids. But it mattered in other ways. It showed that Soviet aviation could produce a strategic bomber in spite of repression, shortages, and shifting priorities. It gave the USSR a psychological weapon at critical moments, both against the enemy and for its own people. And it paved the way for the Soviet bomber forces that would become a central pillar of the country's military power in the Cold War. For these reasons, the Pe-8 endures as more than just an aircraft. It is remembered as a symbol of determination, ingenuity, and the ability of a nation under siege to strike back at its enemies no matter the odds.